So this session, it is all about conflict. So mainly focusing on conflict in the workplace, but I think it'll have benefits to your personal lives as well. Just to make you aware that we are recording the session. So we will share this afterwards with anybody who wants it. And I suppose just bearing that in mind, then if you do choose to share anything in the chat or sharing your video, just bearing in mind that it will be recorded and shared afterwards. I can see a few people there into the chat saying hello. I can see someone's in Norway, someone else is in Switzerland. I am in Dublin, so it's good to see a little bit of a mixture there in terms of people dialing in. So conflict, it's really, I suppose, conflict and misunderstanding generally quite unavoidable in our lives. And everybody has different preferences. Some of us love a good debate. Maybe you have no problem speaking your mind, and maybe that gets you into trouble sometimes. While others maybe shy away from disagreement a bit more. Maybe you even fear conflict or confrontation. But regardless of how you usually handle conflict, I think this session will be for you if you would like to better understand it, some possible benefits from it, and then what to do when maybe it does become a little bit more negative. As that intro video alluded to, this is quite a casual place for learning, so don't be afraid to share questions or comments in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that's perfectly fine. You can ask those questions, you can learn from each other. It is a relatively short session today, so hopefully you'll come away with a little bit of food for thought, and you can go about your day and your week with maybe feeling a little bit more better equipped to handle any kind of tricky conversations that you might have. But if you do find you're coming away from this session going, I think I need a little bit more help or support with that, be it through one-to-one work to kind of develop skills such as emotional intelligence, or be it team building or team coaching to help your team have more productive conflict. Those are things that we do offer. So if it's something you find you will be interested in, feel free to drop me an email or reach out by messaging me on LinkedIn. I'll have all the contact details there at the end for that as well. So I know this can be a topic that, I suppose, for some people, it might be maybe a quite emotive topic, so if you do have any need for any additional support, feel free to reach out. So today we are covering the good, the bad, and the ugly of conflict. So what do we mean by that? Well, the good, I suppose we'll start by thinking, well, what are some of the benefits that conflict can have? How do we have more productive conflict where something good comes out of it, even if it does feel maybe a little bit uncomfortable? What about the bad? What about those conversations where we don't really feel great about having them? Maybe they're conversations that we see as challenging or difficult. At some point in our lives, we'll probably have to have those kinds of conversations. And so it's about making sure that we feel skilled enough to have those kind of conversations, doing them more effectively, more tactfully. And then what about when, conflict can be a bit more on the ugly side? Maybe it's in a toxic work culture or a personal situation where, maybe it's someone we really strongly disagree with or we really dislike them. How do we handle those situations? So those will be the topics that we are covering today. So I'm just going to double check. I can see a couple of people in the chat saying that my connection might be a little bit off. So I hope, I'm just going to have a quick little look and see if I can do anything with that. Fingers crossed, it's just my Zoom kind of warming up and getting used to hosting this. I wonder if hopefully maybe you can let me know if it is very difficult to understand, and I'll try and go off and fix it a little bit, but hopefully you can hear me okay anyway. So what I'd like us to do is start off by, I'd like getting a sense of who's in the room with me. If you go to menti.com, so you can either you can either scan that little QR code down at the bottom, or you can open up a new tab. I can just see, Peter, that you have raised your hand. Did you want to say something there?
Yeah, Julie, your the feed is very bad. You're every 10 seconds it stops starting. So if it's
Okay.
running a half an hour session, you're probably going to lose people, I'd say. You might
Okay.
need to reconnect or onto a better network.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that, Peter. Let me just have a quick little look at what my connection is looking like. I'll just see if there's anything I can kind of close down and have a look at. Yeah, my internet, it's a bit funny because it says that it's fine, but we'll just have a quick little look there. Okay, so I've just closed down a few things. Okay, I'll pop this back up and we'll see how we get on. Okay, so. Okay, yeah, I can see I'm having the kind of connection issues there that people are just saying it's a bit jumpy. Let me just have a quick little look there in the background. But while I'm having a look at that, you can all be voting on the Menti poll. So we can see there the three options. And this is an anonymous vote, so no one will know what you've said, but you can go on there and see. Oh, good, I can see another comment saying the feed has improved, so fingers crossed it stays okay. So hopefully you have been able to either scan the QR code with your phone and go into this Menti poll, or alternatively, if you open up a new tab, go to menti.com and enter the code that's on the screen there. Oh, good. I'm seeing a few comments saying it's improved. Yeah, maybe it was just the Zoom kind of warming up a little bit. But yeah, it's strange when it's you know, it says that it's working fine, and it's hard to know why it isn't. But anyway, hopefully it'll stay all right. So hopefully you can all access that Menti. I'll give you another minute just to let those votes come in. But basically, we're getting a sense now of who falls into which category. Okay, so we've got a couple of people saying that they don't mind having those disagreements. They feel able to speak their mind. Maybe they like a good debate. Maybe some people feeling, I'm uncomfortable with conflict. You know, it's not my favorite thing, but I have some skills that will help me to manage. And then a few others saying that, no, I try to avoid confrontation where possible. Not a fan of conflict. You know, if I can avoid it, then that's ideal. So we can see the kind of mixture there. So I'll keep coming back to this Menti poll. So I'd love to get your input on it. I have a few more questions throughout just to get your input. And we can see it's updating there. So the majority kind of feeling they don't mind having those disagreements. And again, hopefully throughout the session, maybe you'll find ways of, I suppose, having it in a more, you know, productive, constructive way as well. So another question then that I wanted to ask is on this Menti. It should come up now in a second. I think this Menti might be potentially the issue. Do you know what? I'm just going to move along from it. I I think maybe it's me trying to make it a bit too interactive might be slowing the slides down a bit. So when we're talking about conflict and the different kinds of conflict, so we have, I suppose, this differentiation here: task conflict versus interpersonal conflict. So when it comes to work, task conflict is disagreement about content or approaches to solving a problem, or maybe procedures or decisions that relate to our work duties. Whereas the other side, relationship conflict, interpersonal conflict, it's that sort of interpersonal struggle based on maybe differing beliefs or personalities or experiences. And it might have nothing really to do with the task at hand, the task that you're trying to complete. So task conflict arises when, team members have different opinions regarding how they do the work. So for example, if you might have on a team, an engineer and a marketing professional and an IT expert are all working together, they might all have very different opinions on how they need to complete a task. And so that can lead to task or process conflict. And that might mean that, there's missed deadlines or there's lost revenue. So it's not a case that one is better than the other, or it's not that one is easier to solve than another. And also one can turn into another, right? So if you maybe had a disagreement on how to do something, and maybe someone criticizes your way of doing something, and you might take it as a personal attack, and then it becomes that interpersonal conflict. So it's not that one's better than the other, but the upside of task conflict is that it can improve creativity and decision making, right? So if you have one problem and your team can only come up with one way to solve it, that's nice that everybody gets along, but we only have one possible solution. Whereas if you have one problem and your team comes up with 10 different ways to solve it, again, we have to have a bit of a longer discussion, but it's good because we're more likely to have a better solution within one of those 10 different ways of solving the problem. So if we can have those good discussions, then we can come up with better ways to solve the problem. It's much more, I suppose, effective than if everybody instantly agrees, even though that might feel a bit more comfortable. I have another mentee, so let's see how we go. My theory about this being the thing that kind of slows us down. So if everybody can go onto that Menti poll, so you can either scan the QR code or go to the website and enter that code 78013023. And you can vote then on what do you find is your main obstacle to having those kinds of productive discussions. So the first option there is around kind of your company or your team culture. Culture, it's that sort of intangible thing, but it's kind of the way things get done around here. Might not be very clearly vocalized, but it's something that you kind of are aware of what's going on around you. So maybe it's the culture. Maybe it's, feeling that you want to fit in. Very normal desire. We all kind of at some level want to fit in or get along with other people. The third one then is, just trying to avoid, I guess, the discomfort or the effort that is required for those kinds of disagreements. Some people feeling then it is more a case of a lack of confidence. So maybe just feeling, maybe I'm not the expert here, so maybe I shouldn't voice my opinion, or I've only been in the company for a short while, or maybe it's something else, that kind of imposter syndrome or imposter moments that might get in the way of having that conflict, or just feeling that there's some kind of lack of skill. Maybe you feel that your ability to sort of manage your emotions or regulate your emotions isn't where it needs to be, and you're thinking, well, I don't want to start crying or shouting in the office, so I'll hold it in. Or maybe you feel the need to have better kind of communication skills. So we can see a good few people just voting, and the main obstacle that's coming out is that culture element. Also, if there's anything in that poll that maybe isn't included, feel free to put it into the chat. But yeah, we can see there that culture being the main one, and then kind of following that sort of wanting to fit in or wanting to get along with people. Maybe it just feels a bit more easygoing. And yeah, Emer, I just saw your comment there about psychological safety. Absolutely. I think it's so crucial. And we'll touch on that now shortly, because I'm not hugely surprised to see that culture is the main obstacle for people having that kind of conflict. Maybe it's just they feel that it's not really expected. So one of the sort of frameworks that I find useful when we think of this kind of, how do we have that productive conflict, comes from Kim Scott. She formerly was working with Google, and she has her own company now. She has this book called Radical Candor. And in this framework, we can see that the way that we can, grow and develop is to care personally about people, but also be willing to challenge people directly. So caring personally, really actually showing the person that you're speaking to that they matter. And then also challenge directly, being willing to step into that discomfort that can come from confrontation. If you just start pushing someone and they don't know that you have their back, they will probably get defensive. They probably won't be very responsive. If you are really nice to someone, you really care about them, that's fine, but it probably will get in the way of progress overall. We do need some level of challenge to strive for. Imagine if you were working away and you think that you're doing fine, and then your manager actually says, look, you haven't been performing well for months, and it's gotten to a stage, it's quite a serious stage. So, maybe they're saying you need to be let go, or you're on a performance improvement plan, or, whatever it might be. And you're kind of thinking, oh, where did this come from? Why didn't somebody tell me this sooner? I would have much rather had that feedback. And maybe the manager felt, oh, I didn't want to hurt your feelings, or, I didn't want to have that tricky conversation. So, the short-term comfort can lead to a long-term headache, and a bit more of a greater problem there. So, how do we do that radical candor piece? It's things like asking for criticism, and asking. You might need to ask more than once, because people might not feel fully comfortable with it. Offering praise, being specific when things go well, and then providing clear and kind criticism as well when things aren't going well. And then gauging how what you've said has landed, and then adjusting accordingly. Not completely backing down and saying, okay, forget I ever said anything if somebody gets upset. But just, you might need to dial up the care personally element if someone is becoming upset. If we are just in that piece there of we really care, but we're not challenging, that silence to avoid hurting someone's feelings in the short term is kind of a trade-off for the long run. The idea of just challenging without actually caring about someone, I think some managers might fall into that belief that they need to just challenge, push. But it can come across sometimes as bullying or arrogant, or kind of contempt. And then the bottom left quadrant there, when things are just kind of passive aggressive, or there's this sort of politics going on behind the scenes, you haven't showed you cared about people, and you're also not willing to challenge them either. So that one's obviously the least effective of all. But if you think about it, like if you picture this, right? So say, for example, we have a dog at home, big golden retriever. He's a big dog. Like if he starts pulling on the lead, I'm going with him. He's a strong dog. So imagine I'm walking down the street and the dog is like pulling me into traffic, basically. And I'm trying to, be nice to my dog because I care about him, but also I'm worried that he's pulling me into traffic. So if someone came up to me and said, you need to train that dog better, he's going to pull you into traffic, it's not safe, I'd be kind of probably thinking, okay, who are you to give me that feedback? I didn't ask for that. Whereas if someone else came up and said, oh, like, you clearly love your dog very much, but the way he's pulling on that lead doesn't seem like it's safe. I have a big dog as well. Do you mind if I share what worked for me in training him? I'm going to be so much more receptive to that. I'm going to absolutely be happy to listen to that feedback, because I know it's coming from a place of caring. But at the same time, there's that bit of challenge there. So that's one framework. And then, like mentioned in the chat there, fearless organization, a fearless team. So that idea of psychological safety. So for anyone who hasn't come across that term, it's basically a culture or an environment in which people feel safe to express and be themselves. So how do we create that? It doesn't really happen overnight, but in terms of creating that kind of culture where people do feel safe to have disagreements, one of the things we can do is setting the stage for this. So getting everyone clear on the purpose of why we're doing this work, and setting expectations about, look, this is new territory. We'll make mistakes. That's okay. We'll learn from them. Setting those expectations clearly. The second step is trying to demonstrate humility, letting go of the need to be right or to know everything. Of course, that can be difficult, again, depending on the existing culture, but it can allow other people, I suppose, especially as a leader, if you take this step, acknowledging, like, I don't have all the answers. That's why we all need to kind of work together to solve this problem. Inviting participation then. So like we mentioned, asking questions, really opening up a conversation, listening to people. And again, if you're finding that people aren't giving their input, maybe you might set up some kind of structure, maybe for anonymous inputs initially, right? So, or maybe it's a case of, if you're in a meeting, making sure that every person in the meeting has spoken before you move on, right? So not just kind of going, is everyone okay with that? Yeah, okay, brilliant, moving on, right? So actually making sure everyone speaks. Showing then that you're grateful when people do give their input. And again, even if you don't agree with it, or even if it's an idea that you don't end up doing, still appreciating that they've given that idea. So give that praise that is specific, succinct, and sincere. So remembering those 3 S's. And trying as much as possible to destigmatize failure. Try to, if something goes wrong, look for ways to blame the process rather than the person. So I've worked with leaders in the past where they're kind of saying, look, I keep telling my people what to do, and they keep making the same mistakes. I would then be encouraging that leader to look inwards and say, well, how can we set it up so that it's much less likely that people are making those mistakes? How do we look forward rather than criticize and look back? For example, in the instructions that you gave them, are there visuals, or is it the instructions are in some lengthy manual somewhere? So is there a clear process? It should be possible for people to clearly understand. So, trying to destigmatize failure, but at the same time, if there is a clear process and someone violates that should be sanctioned as well, to show that you're committed to, high standards and accountability. So yeah, I can just see in the chat there, Emer saying about experimenting and learning with teams is a great way to work. And Catherine is saying, allowing ourselves to be more playful again and experiment. Absolutely. Matthias, you're saying about humility. We all make mistakes. No one is flawless. So absolutely. So this is, as we kind of visualize there, it is a journey. It does require lots of small steps. It's not about, trying to do this all overnight, but there are those little steps that you can be taking to help create this kind of culture. So we've talked now about the good side of conflict, when we have a culture that, ideally is able to make mistakes and openly discuss them and learn from them. What about now going into that, the bad side of conflict, maybe the conversations that need to happen, but maybe you don't quite feel comfortable or skilled enough to have. So these kinds of maybe tricky conversation. I think that when we have these kinds of beliefs that can sometimes limit us, I want to try and get us to see it with new eyes, putting on like a different pair of glasses to see it through a different lens. So it's about, I suppose, acknowledging those kinds of beliefs that can get in the way of us having these conversations. So a really valuable skill here is assertiveness. Using assertiveness effectively means that you're considering others while also getting your point across and having your say. And using skills like empathy and curiosity, as a few people have mentioned in the chat, alongside that skill of assertiveness, that will really help you to, get your own kind of points across. And just looking at this graphic, it might be worth reflecting on, where do you think that you fall on this? Do you ever veer more towards the passive side, whereby, this might be like if you are in work and you're getting really frustrated and you feel you want to go home and just vent to your partner or your friend or your family, rather than, talking to the person who it relates to. If you ever feel that you're just kind of bottling things up, it might be a sign that you're going more towards that passive side. And then the other side is the more aggressive side. So if you feel that, maybe you're expressing maybe more negative emotions or destructive emotions, maybe if you find people kind of backing away or going, yeah, that's fine, just to kind of try and calm you down, any of those kinds of signs might indicate that you tend towards the more aggressive side. And again, sometimes, we might be assertive most of the time, but maybe under pressure, the more negative side comes out. So maybe we veer towards passive or aggressive when we are stressed or when it's a really difficult situation. So with that in mind, just a couple of points on how we can have those more tricky conversations. The first one being, being aware of how you are viewing yourself, and trying to shift that mindset. If there's any kind of voice in your head that's telling you, I'm no good at this, I can't deal with conflict, I can't deal with confrontation. If you were telling yourself that, then you are probably going to act in alignment with it, because if we have that sense of our identity, we will act in alignment with it. So trying to maybe rephrase it and saying, look, if I have this conversation, I'm actually benefiting both parties. So if you feel I want to avoid conflict, you might say, well, I'm not avoiding conflict by not voicing my opinion. The conflict is still there. I'm just prolonging it. So actually, if I want to avoid conflict, I need to step into that discomfort and have a difficult conversation. Another thing I suppose to consider there is, if you are someone who's telling yourself, oh, I'm really bad at this, you might change the way you phrase that. So maybe, I'm not as skilled as I would like to be just yet, but my way of getting to that level is by practicing. So I'm going to have this conversation. So trying to shift mindset a bit, and also bearing in mind that not to tell the other person, look, I feel really bad about this. I feel awful. I'm so sorry to be telling you this, because then you're kind of soliciting empathy and sympathy from them, and you're putting the focus onto yourself rather than on the person who's receiving the potentially difficult message. Like if you're saying, look, we're downsizing, I'm so sorry, I feel terrible to have to tell you, it's kind of then telling that person they need to feel sorry for you, which is kind of compounding the problem a little bit. So bearing that in mind in terms of how you view yourself and how you label these kinds of conversations. Doing a bit of preparation in advance, not scripting it and reading off a script, because that will obviously come across as very kind of fake or hollow. But do your bit of preparation. If you're going into a difficult conversation, again, maybe this is performance management issue where someone's not performing at the level you need to. Maybe you need to let somebody go. Maybe it's some kind of ongoing issue in terms of how someone is treating you, like whatever it might be. I think everyone has had their share of experiences where something is not quite right and they need to have a conversation to address it. So I suppose picture that in your mind as we go through these points. But when you're preparing for them, you might think, well, what's the minimum outcome that I will accept from this? What is the best possible outcome that I'll accept from this conversation? What's the ideal that I'm going for? What's the worst possible outcome? And how will I handle that if I do encounter it? So do that bit of preparation to get yourself ready to go into it. Really valuable point here is to try and hold the other person in high regard. And that is not always easy because, as we say, these are tricky conversations. It might be someone that you really disagree with, or, maybe they've done something that you just can't see how they view that as being acceptable or a good idea. But you will get a lot more from yourself and from them, from the whole conversation, if you are holding them to a high regard, showing them that you respect them. And one element here is kind of checking your own weirdness, recognizing that the way that you see the world is different to how other people see it. So the person that you are going into a conversation with, they have a huge number of factors that are influencing their behavior. They're all these things that you're not aware of, like their upbringing, their personality, their past work experiences, their current home environment, all of these different things that you're not fully aware of. And they are bringing all of that with them. So just trying to suspend that judgment that may be there, and trying to just recognize that, you can still have empathy for someone even if you don't agree with them. I can see a few people popping things into the chat, which is great. I will come to those in a minute, but definitely keep them coming because, as we say, it's great for everyone to kind of learn from each other. So the fourth point there is to try to understand the person first before you go to be understood. So really trying to understand that person's perspective, asking them open questions that you don't necessarily know the answer to. So, for example, rather than saying, why haven't you got that done? You might say, the project is behind the deadline. What obstacles are in your way? So trying to get those open questions so that people aren't getting defensive. Like say, if you ask a question that starts with why, it usually will tell the person that they need to justify what they've done. So they'll probably be inclined to try to defend themselves. But what we want instead is for them to, come up with possible solutions. So how might we do this? What can we do to overcome this obstacle or whatever else? So those kinds of open questions. Showing them that you are listening to them is really, really valuable. So maybe it's paraphrasing back what they've said, providing that eye contact, not just looking at a phone or having the laptop in front of you. Really showing you're listening. Again, opens up all the potential possibilities. It allows someone to feel, okay, this is someone who cares about me. So going back to that quadrant of caring personally with challenging directly. Thinking of that balancing act between courage and compassion. So for certain situations, you will kind of need to dial up the compassion. Like, for example, if someone is getting quite upset, you'll need to be a bit more compassionate. But also, sometimes you'll really need to tap into the bravery that it takes to get your point across and to stand your ground. So it's recognizing when you need to dial one up or dial one down. And kind of a related point there is taking your time, pausing, checking in. So the example there is, look, I've noticed you've gone a bit quiet. What are you thinking? How is what I've said making you feel? Notice how your message is landing. And noticing their emotions, recognizing that their emotions or their reaction is not your responsibility. It's not within your control, but you can be considerate of it. So allowing them that bit of space to maybe feel upset if it is an upsetting thing. Okay. So let's come back to that Menti poll and see, does anyone have any ideas in terms of how do you manage heated situations? How do you deal with those more maybe destructive emotions? Because, all of those last points, if we can follow them, great. But the potential derailer is our own emotions. Like we said, when we're under pressure, sometimes the more negative aspects of our personality can come out. So pop any thoughts you have into the chat there. How do you manage your emotions? How do you maybe calm yourself down when you're in a difficult situation? Someone says, I just sulk. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, it might just be a case of, okay, I'm going to take this inwards. I'm going to keep it to myself. So yeah, let's see if anybody else has any ideas there in terms of managing. We can see people saying about, slowing down the breath, reduce the binary, find out what you share in common, remove the us versus them. Absolutely. I think that's a really valuable point. Again, a few people thinking of the happy place or the calm place, taking some deep breaths. I like this one, get permission to take space if appropriate. So, I'm just going to grab a glass of water. Give you a minute to get a bit of space. Take a note of your body, your breath, the tension, keeping yourself grounded. Absolutely. Yeah. And we can keep those comments coming in, but I think that what we just talked about there really relates to a couple of the points on the next slide. How do we manage our emotions? Coming back to your breath and focusing on your body, recognizing where the tension is that you're feeling. And I know that not everyone feels comfortable with things like meditation or mindfulness. Some people, when they hear those terms, they kind of go, oh, no, I don't really buy into all of that. But just being aware of our breath and coming back to that for a minute allows us to be more resourceful in handling those kinds of tricky conversations. So that is kind of why people they meditate and they practice mindfulness, because it does help us to choose how we want to respond. Another one that came in on that last point was taking a break, giving yourself a little bit of space where possible. Just recognizing and even just labeling how you're feeling. Just recognizing that, okay, that's an emotion. An emotion is just an emotion. It's not, it's not wrong. It's not, it's not incorrect to feel how you're feeling. But it just allows you to see a feeling for what it is, which is a transient source of data, and it may or may not prove helpful. It may or may not be telling you something useful, but it's just something that, will pass, but it's worth recognizing where it's coming from. And another one that might be just to say some kind of mantra, developing some kind of saying or a thing you can tell yourself to remind yourself to kind of remain calm. So maybe just, this will pass, going, okay, I'm feeling this at the moment, but it'll pass soon. Maybe saying, this isn't about me, trying to say, I'm, not taking it personally. Or sometimes, maybe if you're in an argument that's kind of going around in a circle, maybe there's not really a point to it. You might say, look, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Because sometimes we do kind of get caught up in no, I need to make sure that I'm right here. But sometimes at the end of that kind of conversation, we're not really coming away feeling like we've won anything. So that's one that I sometimes use for myself, is just, do I want to be happy or do I want to be right? It's kind of picking your battles. So these are a couple of things to be mindful of when we are going into those kinds of difficult situations. So we talked about the good, the bad, going into now maybe the ugly, as in, what about when you do really disagree with someone? Maybe there's a history or a past there. And one kind of illustration or example that we can learn from is from Nelson Mandela. Sometimes, we do have to interact with people that are very different to us, or that we strongly oppose. So in this image, we have Nelson Mandela, or Madiba, and how he dealt with, a story we can learn from is how he dealt with the man just beside him there, General Viljoen. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but he was the Afrikaans leader of a nationalist military movement. He was a very highly respected leader, but a very racist one. He was dubbed the ultimate enforcer of apartheid in South Africa. So obviously these two people have very different beliefs, and Viljoen thought Mandela was a terrorist who deserved execution. He threatened to rebel against him when Mandela was the president. And so Mandela had a choice then. He can say, well, I can go in and just basically crush these guys, and a lot of lives are going to be lost and it's going to be a horrible conflict, but that's the cost. Or he said, I could try and talk to this guy and see if I can bring him on board. And that is what he did. He chose the latter route. So he invited this general to his house. And one of the things he did was firstly take him aside, so that he wasn't around his entourage. So already he's trying to kind of make it not a status battle. He's kind of lowering the stakes a bit. And Mandela served him tea, which might sound like a very simple task, but he didn't get a servant to do it. He didn't, order it in. He said, how do you like your tea, General? Do you want one sugar or two? Do you take milk? He asked those questions and he made it himself. And what that kind of small task did was he signaled to him, I am happy to serve you. I'm going to lower myself to the position of someone who is going to make you tea. It's not getting straight into the tough negotiation, but it's saying, look, I'm starting off on a place of mutual respect, and then we can get into some pretty tough discussions and tough negotiations. And the reason that we know about this story now is because the general did become part of the democratic process and actually became a huge admirer of Mandela. So as Catherine says there in the chat, making it personal, show you're human too, eye level, connection over judgment. Exactly. So I think that's an example that we can kind of learn from. So when it comes to people that we do strongly disagree with, a couple of points from that example and others. Firstly, starting with making that human connection. Look for maybe some common ground, maybe being willing to share something. And because there is this norm of reciprocity, which means that we repay in kind, what someone else has done for us. So, maybe if you are a parent and you know that the person that you're disagreeing with is also a parent, you might mention something about your kids and they might respond in kind. And then you're two parents is sharing experiences rather than two enemies with nothing in common. So trying to make that connection first. Letting go as well of the need to control, because we can't control someone's behaviors, thoughts, or feelings. Sometimes when we meet someone and we think we really disagree with them, or we think they are deluded, we want to nearly cure them of that belief. But attempting to do so typically just makes things worse. So letting go of that need to control others. Giving your adversary the opportunity to feel good about themselves, kind of allowing them to save face. So like we saw there with Mandela taking Viljoen away from his entourage, it's lowering the status, because disagreements can become toxic when it is a case of a status battle, when people are really concerned about the impression they're giving off, if they're in front of an audience of colleagues. So that's why I think, might have heard that phrase of, like, oh, we'll take this offline. If a conversation is getting heated, it's kind of saying, look, we'll take this to a private space so that we don't have to prove ourselves to anyone. It doesn't become that status issue. But this point here is actually why psychological safety is so valuable, because if you do have that climate where it is safe to have a disagreement, then you might not need to kind of, allow the person to save face, because they know that they'll still be accepted by their team if there is a disagreement. In arguments and disagreements, there are always going to be mistakes. Of course, they are. You're not a robot reciting off some, your logical points. Like, you're going to make mistakes, and making that, when something goes wrong, making that very clear to quickly and authentically apologize can actually really improve the conversation and the relationship. And it's okay if the apology is very difficult to make, because that actually means that it's more impactful, basically. And then the fifth point there is to bring in some element of novelty or surprise. Try and disrupt the script, because especially for people maybe in our personal lives, we can get locked into these kind of simple, predictable patterns of disagreement. So we want to try and be surprising and disrupt that. So I'll give you an example of those types of conversations. So if someone says, I really enjoyed that book, someone else says, oh, really? It's very poorly written. She says, why do you have to make me feel bad about what I like? He says, why do you have to play the victim all the time? She says, oh, that's rich. You're always playing the victim. He goes, look, you're clearly in a bad mood today. She's like, I'm the bad mood, and so on and so forth. It gets into this kind of predictable, maybe rhythm. This might be a kind of conversation they've had many times before. So, and as they go on, like, there's nothing to solve or to conclude it. So as they go on, they become more unpleasant. So you might forget at the end what the argument was even really about, but you will be remembering how that other person made you feel. So that's why we need to try and, mix things up a bit. Maybe it's unexpectedly agreeing with something, or switching over the topic for a little while. Varying what you say and how you say it, using different language, maybe a touch of warmth, maybe even a little touch of humor, whatever it might be, trying to find that space to create new ways of communicating. And then what about, as an employee, if we're in a kind of culture where we have this sort of toxic environment, it can help us feel, or can make us feel very powerless. It can make us feel we're lacking confidence. So what are some of the ways that we can just handle that? One being to try and raise your game and not stoop to the level of other people. So that's where your grounding techniques will come in handy. The not reacting to the fight or flight response, trying to calm that before responding. Figuring out what is within your control, what can you influence, because it can be exhausting to fight against what we don't have control over. It can also really be kind of disempowering to focus on all the things that are outside of our control. So figuring out how you think about the situation, how you use your language, reminding yourself of the power that you do hold. In toxic cultures, feedback can often be stifled. You might feel afraid to speak up. So this third point is, may or may not be applicable, but where possible, if you can provide a bit of feedback in maybe your employee survey or your one-to-one with your manager, because the manager might not be fully aware of the extent of the problem. And they are much more likely to do something if you speak up rather than if you stay silent. But obviously I know that one is a bit tricky. Try and find allies within your workplace, building those positive relationships so that you don't feel as alone when it comes to dealing with this. You may want to then create a paper trail, just, reminding yourself that, or having a kind of record of the sort of agreements, so that they're not just verbal or tacit agreements. So maybe if you have a phone call with someone, following up with a quick email, just, again, this one is kind of a bit more protecting yourself in case you might have hassle in the future. And then really coming down to, assessing what this job is providing for you. If all else fails and you've tried to work around it, the best possible solution might be to remove yourself from a company or a team, which can take a lot of courage. But I suppose it's really weighing up what the job is giving for you, because it can be a financial risk to leave a job, but it can absolutely be a health risk to stay in a toxic culture. So if anybody has any questions at this stage, pop them into the chat. I can see a lot of people are having those conversations in the chat, which is great. So we can see there about, like kind of gossiping and things like that. People talking there about, the kind of the culture. So definitely keep those conversations going. But again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. But just to kind of wrap it up as we come towards 12 o'clock, think about the good. So some conflict, mostly focusing on how to solve a problem or how to do something, it can be beneficial. When it can be beneficial is typically when you're in a psychologically safe environment, when you have a culture that accepts that people will make mistakes or that it's okay to have a disagreement. So trying to, as much as possible, create that environment. And there are things that you can do both as the leader and as an employee. When you are dealing with those situations that make you feel bad, the challenging ones, tapping into skills like empathy, curiosity, your listening skills, and your emotional regulation, your ability to handle and manage difficult emotions when you're in those kind of challenging situations. And when it comes to people that you do really strongly disagree with, or maybe you have a negative past with, try to make a connection with them. Showing someone empathy doesn't mean you agree with them. It's not endorsement. It's just empathy. Letting go of the need to control how they feel or behave, and trying to find those ways to make the person you disagree with feel good about themselves, so that they don't feel the need to, be defensive and try and, win this status battle. Okay. A couple of books, there's lots more that are on my reading list, but these are a few that I found helpful. So How to Disagree by Ian Leslie is a good one. Never Split the Difference. I'm kind of 80% of the way through that one. Actually, I haven't quite finished it, but it's more about negotiating. So those kinds of difficult conversations. Emotional intelligence, then, a really valuable set of skills. That is something that I've worked with hundreds of individuals and teams with, to help them develop those skills to be empathetic, to be assertive, to be able to manage their own emotions and understand the emotions of others. Really, really valuable, especially in any job where there's any bit of kind of socially or emotionally demanding tasks. And then the last two there are more so on the work culture. So I didn't put in Radical Candor there, but also that one by Kim Scott. And then we've got Amy Edmondson, The Fearless Organization, and Timothy Clark, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. If anybody else has any other books, pop them into the chat. That would be beneficial. So as we come towards the end, just want to signal how you can keep in touch. If you have, as I mentioned at the start, this is sometimes something that, this is a fairly high level session. If it's something you want to delve into a little bit deeper, feel free to drop me an email, drop me a message on LinkedIn. If you've registered for this session, you will get an email afterwards with the slides, some resources, the recording, everything like that. So you will be able to kind of keep in touch with us those ways. And also just to give you the heads up on our next session. So on the 27th of September, we will have Stuart Nelson talking about kind of business resilience in all the chaos that everybody is dealing with. So being able to thrive in the face of chaos. And then on the 11th of October, we are talking about hybrid work and how to manage performance there. So joined by Padraig O'Connor there. So really looking forward to having that conversation. I know we're just coming up to 12, so I want to say thank you all so much for joining me for this session. As I say, if you've any questions, feel free to get in touch. But hopefully I will see you at the next session, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.